Hey everybody, Jem Schofield of the C47 and another episode of Gearbox 2.0. It's a live stream. It says I'm live, so feel free to pop into the chat and say something and let me know. It seems like everything's okay, but you never know when it comes to the interwebs. So just give me a heads up. Hold on, I'm going to make a little change over here just to make sure that everything is cooperating. And one day, maybe up on this hill, I will get some faster internets. So I've got a hey there. Can anybody hear me? Can anybody see me? There's definitely some people here in the room. I want to hear from somebody and make sure that the picture and the audio is okay. And if it is, then I'll start jumping into stuff. And just as a reminder, there we go. Looks like things are working. Thank you, Clay. Awesome. Okay, good. Just a reminder that today at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have another episode of Camera and Flask on this channel. It will be myself, Caleb Pike, and Ben Barden. I will be hosting this week because people are giving me crap about not hosting. And this week we are talking about Netflix approved cameras. We just had the S1H approved this past week. And Dustin, thank you for letting me know I am coming through loud and clear. You never know. Now, one of the things that we were trying to do this week was try a new streaming solution. No bueno. Because it seems like everybody gets fed through whoever is hosting that stream. Now, if we were pushing through Caleb's incredibly fast, super duper califragilistic expialidocious internet connection, then maybe it wouldn't be a problem. But I am not that lucky over here on the hill. So we are sticking with Lightstream for now, and we'll see how it goes. I'm hoping that they keep updating this and they don't go under. And I'm also hoping that they do not, well, I actually don't mind if they charge. If they charged, it wouldn't be a big deal, but there you go. All right, so welcome everybody. We've got some actual people here in the room. We're gonna talk a little bit about Fuji here. The chat is up, so I'll be checking that. So please ask questions. Always best, just like Dustin has done, to do an @the_C47 to grab my attention. So if you're not conversing with each other, I basically get a red flag that says blah, blah, blah. And I read it and I answer it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like the content you're seeing. I've been really thinking about that. Man, I think it's moving more and more towards the old days of Gearbox where I'm just going to be talking about one particular thing that I'm interested in every week. We'll talk more about that later on. Okay, so X-T3, I'd love to hear in the chat if anybody is shooting with Fujifilm cameras, whether they have just borrowed it for a job, rented it, or they own a Fuji-based camera system. I originally got into this ecosystem with the XE2, and I bought it strictly for one reason, and that was as a walk-around stills camera. And I like range finder style cameras where your viewfinder is off to the side, not in the center of the camera system. From there, I shot quite a bit with the XE3, though I never owned the camera. And I just started to invest in lenses. And then when the X-T3 came out, I was frankly shocked because I didn't think that Fuji was going to go the route of really putting strong video features into their mirrorless cameras. I really thought they were on this path of APS-C or super 35mm sensor size and medium format, and they were going to go down those two lanes. I had no idea it was going to be this strong in the video front. So when I was thinking about getting a camera to travel with, because I had started to do Camera and Flask again last year, Gearbox started up again last year, I was wondering what that camera could be. I wasn't really thrilled with going into DSLR or mirrorless camera, and I sure as heck didn't want to lug around the C200 or even C100 Mark I for that matter, which I still have two of. So, you know, for me, what was really interesting is I was actually thinking about upgrading to the X-T3, and then which had some video features. I shot a vlog on it once, but it really did not have what this camera has. So Dustin says, yep, I'm particularly interested in today's chat. I've shot on the XE1 to XT1, currently own an XT3 and XT2 and use a lot for video production and stills. Yeah, I mean, for me, and of course, what I did once I purchased this camera is I started to create some content around it. I really wanted to figure out for the channel how I could talk about using this camera for video production. Now, from a stills standpoint, I absolutely do use it for stills. We'll talk a little bit about my lenses and some of that stuff in a minute, and also maybe some little tips that I can give you in terms of how I'm rigging up the camera and doing some things like that, though there is already some content on that on the channel. But I think what I'm going to do is jump into the menu. Again, I'm going to be looking at the chat here. Hopefully everybody can see this. Lens cap is on right now, just so that the menu is clear to everybody. And I'm just going to go in there. And I just want to talk about some things that I think are some gotchas with the camera system. And one is one that I recently found out about. Yes, I'm taking my glasses off. Yes, I'm getting older. Dang, it hurts. It's not pretty. So I'm going to go over here into the setup, and this really has to do with screen setup. So I'm going into setup, screen setup, and I'm going to scroll down here. I'm in movie mode on the dial, by the way, on this left-handed dial, and I'm scrolling all the way down here. And the important one that we're going to talk about here, and it looks like it is pushing, is the information contrast adjustment setting. When you go into this setting here, there are 4 options. You can set your screen to a high contrast, a standard, a low contrast, and then there's one called dark ambient lighting. And one of the things that I've noticed when shooting with this camera in low light, so you're looking into the shadows a lot, is when you hit record on the camera system, you actually see what looks like exposure changes while that record is blinking on and off. So it looks like the screen's getting lighter, darker, darker. It's mainly noticeable in the shadows portion of your image. The good news is that it's not getting recorded to your recorded image. The bad news is that anything that you see when you're monitoring that's a distraction is not a good situation. Now, of course, a lot of the times when I'm shooting video, I'm using an external monitor, but there are times where I just want to pick up the camera and put a lens on there and use the built-in screen. And so what I found is that if you take your information contrast adjustment and you set it to this dark ambient lighting, then I'm not noticing that change in terms of brightness. It's kind of like a pulsing change of brightness, on, off, and that will hopefully help you out a little bit in terms of that situation. Now, it wasn't something that I had noticed for a long time, but I was doing some lower light tests with the new 16 to 80, and I was seeing how far I could push ISO or ISO on this camera. And let's actually talk about that. And that's when I noticed this problem. Now, the thing that I'll say about Fuji cameras, and this seems to be more of an issue with the older cameras than it does with a camera like the X-T3, is ISO is supposed to be an international standard, right? It's supposed to be something that designates particular values that relate to exposure. And we used to call it ASA, we now call it ISO, and basically that standard is saying that when we are increasing or decreasing the sensitivity of our sensor to light, that we should have a predictable amount of exposure based on the aperture and the shutter speed that the camera is set to. And the problem is that bad karma, behave yourself, The problem is that when I was using the XE2, the XE2, I was noticing that compared to my Canon DSLRs, that 1600 ISO on the XE2 was closer to about an 800 on the 5D Mark III. That's about a stop. Well, it is a stop, but I didn't measure it scientifically. But it looked like I was getting about half as much light at a particular ISO on the XE2. Now, it's not quite there with the X-T3. It's much better than that. What's up, Gerald? But there is still, it seems like, a slight difference in ISO compared to some of the other cameras. This is most noticeable to me when I'm shooting with a Sony A7 series, which are incredibly sensitive to light. But if you set a Sony, let's say A7S II to 3200 ISO, I would venture to guess that 3200 ISO on this is not going to give you the same exact exposure. So that's the deal. So think about that. It's not a big deal. I would say that probably at most a third of a stop now in terms of difference with ISO with this camera compared to some other cameras. But again, not scientific. It's just something to look out for. And ISO performance is very good on this camera. But once you're in darker environments and there's not a lot of light in the environment, it will struggle, especially when you're using a lens like this 16-80, which is an f4 all the way through. So once you've got faster prime lenses on there, it's a little bit different, but there you go. All right, so in terms of workflow, you know, the jobs that we do for clients are between Final Cut Pro 10 and Premiere Pro, depending on what we're doing and how we have to deliver the project. So we're using both Creative Cloud for certain projects. A lot of stuff is done in Final Cut. But what I'm trying to do when I'm shooting is I'm trying to decide, of course, we decide what frame rate we're shooting in and what's the aspect ratio. For a lot of us, that's going to be probably this 4K version, which is, you know, UHD 4K, 3840 by 2160. And then you're going to choose your frame rate and you're going to choose your data rate. Now, that is dependent upon how you have it set up over here with H.265 or H.264. To me, I want to get the most out of my camera system, so I'm generally going to be shooting in H.265, relatively not new codec, but it's a codec that's not been around for as long as H.264. But it does give us internally 420 10-bit. So you go down in H.264 to 8-bit internally. So I want to shoot that way. But what I found is that that from a data rate standpoint, hey Rich, how's it going? From a data rate standpoint, that for me personally, that that 200 megabits per second is giving me a quality of image that is, I would say, basically close to the 400 megabits per second. It's not, because it's a lower data rate, but visibly to my eye with the tests that I've done, 200 megabits per second. And that's a lot less math, you know. Oh, Santa Ana winds. What's going down in California right now is heartbreaking, by the way. If you're from outside this country, or even away from this coast, you're not necessarily getting the information that we are about what's happening, especially in Southern California right now, and the fires are just crazy. Sorry for the pivot there. So 200 megabits per second, frame rate, obviously, depending on what you're doing. And the other thing that I've found, at least for Final Cut, is it doesn't like all intra as much as it likes long GOP, which is a long group of pictures, which is basically, you know, let's say you're shooting 24 frames per second, first 12 frames broken up, next 12 frames, and first frame is generally what we call an I-frame, and that's all the information. And then you have bidirectional and predictive frames, and this is a compression method that's been used for a very long time. In fact, in the old days when I used to author DVDs, we were using long GOP all the time. So it's more math for your NLE to do, but for some reason, it is when you're shooting in H.265 and 200 megabits per second, at least for Final Cut Pro 10, long GOP is a better option I have found in terms of speed of workflow than all intra. Now you do your own experiments and all that fun stuff and see how that all works out for you. Tommy, it is a great camera to use on the gimbal. The AF system is really great. One little trick that I learned from Caleb Pike over at DSLR Video Shooter is that generally your AF system is working better when you're actually recording. So when you go into, for instance, your autofocus settings here under movie setting, and you go in and you set your tracking sensitivity and your AF speed, that really doesn't show in the way it's going to function until you start recording. And then you're going to have slower ramps and things like that. I mean, racks when you're shooting. And it's going to latch onto and stay latched onto objects for a longer period of time or shorter period of time, depending on how you set your tracking sensitivity. So it's important to know that that's going to give you the best functionality when you're actually recording. So even if I'm doing something like a live stream and I'm using this camera, which I like to do, it's better for me to just put a big card in there and just hit record, even if I'm not going to use that content. Tommy's also in LA, surrounded by fire. Yeah, it's crazy. And then the power outages that are being put into place by PGE in Northern California, it's just, I'm really sorry for what you guys are going through. We do get fires up here in Oregon as well, but you guys are at a different level. All right, so hopefully that helps with the AF stuff. Let's just get back into some other things here. This one's a pretty big one that some people who are not familiar with this camera, and I even forget sometimes about, which is dynamic range. We can set our dynamic range to 100, 200%, 400%. There's no auto like there is in the stills mode in the camera, but what this basically means is that it's trying to give you a better dynamic range overall for your image. The upside is you should be retaining more detail in the highlights, but the downside is that it's going to force you in terms of your ISO where you can't go below 640. So let's just go back in the menu. I'll go to 200% and we'll come back out of here. And you can see it's locking me into 320 or above. And when it says auto, it's just going to use 320 or above. And then if I go here into dynamic range 100% and we look at that, you can see that I can go to ISO 160. So you have more control over ISO when you are set to dynamic range 100, but of course you're not retaining as much information in the highlights. So it's forcing you to that base 640, which is very similar to the way a lot of other cameras will work. If you're shooting outside, then you might want to set it to dynamic range 400%, but just know that you're going to be using more ND and things like that. So Oleg is asking, what's up, Oleg? What external power option would you recommend for an X-T3 video rig? So it's right here. This is my powering solution. You know, while it's very convenient to have a little small setup, and I have a ton of these little batteries right here. I think I have 6. I might even have 8 right now. Tommy did a whole video explaining dynamic range setting on X-T3. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So Tommy, if you want to put a link to that in the chat, that would be awesome. I love sharing other people's content, which would be great. And then I will continue to answer Oleg's question. So what I'm doing personally is I'm actually powering this camera right now off of this battery, which is on the SMALLHD focus monitor. And I can put basically any Sony NPF size battery on here. And then what I have is a dummy battery, which is for the Fujifilm cameras, which is running here from the power to the camera itself. I do not have to have the monitor on in order to power the camera system. I do have it off right now, and then I'm just going to go ahead and fire it on right now. Now, obviously, the advantage of keeping it off for when I'm using it for live streams and things like that is that it is using less power because it's not having to power the screen as well. I'm using a Cameo little friction-based mount. There's other ones by other companies like SMALLHD, and I have that attached to this little cold shoe handle from SmallRig. You can actually watch the video on that. I'm not a fan of cold shoe style attachments, though this handle here has a tie down so that this monitor can't come out, which is nice. It's like a quick release type of thing. And most of the time now I'm just using the little wireless Go receiver, and I'm just putting that into a cold shoe because that's the way it's designed. I do sometimes put a small 15 mil rod here, and then I have a little setup with a cold shoe attachment, so I can put a different type of receiver on there, like the Sony UWP, and that's the way I'm basically powering it. Let me see. Minimum. What did I say? Let me read Tommy's. Did I say something wrong, or are you correcting what you said? That's all right. You can clarify, Tommy. And if one of us is saying the wrong thing, let's figure out what we're saying that's incorrect. So 3+. Hey, Jem, it's 360 grad at work. Could you please explain HEVC? Thank you. Basically, it's H.265. It's a more efficient version of MPEG-4 Part 10, I believe. It's still part of that. And essentially, got it, Tommy. It is giving you similar file sizes, but you can either go higher quality or higher resolution. There's a give or take there. But just a more efficient codec, though it requires a different way of processing it in post-production, which is why some NLEs are more favorable to it than others, and why it's not supported across the boards by everything at this time. Broadcast television is still basically H.264. I think maybe eventually it'll be HEVC because we are going to need ways to push 4K through pipes at a higher quality, but at similar data rates. That's basically what HEVC is. What does it stand for? I can't remember what the acronym stands for right now. Okay, cool. So what do we got? Other things to discuss here. Well, I think, you know, one of the things that you have to also realize when you're going into this ecosystem, which is very important to think about, I think HEVC is the same as regular H.265. It's all in that, yeah, that's my understanding. And as you can see here, it says H.265 HEVC. Somebody can look up the acronym and just post it in the chat. So lenses are sort of the next thing to discuss having to do with this camera system. First of all, I'm a fanboy. I think that the glass that Fuji's putting out is exceptional. There is one lens which is currently, quote unquote, the kit lens that you can get with a lot of their camera systems, which is the little one here. These are old Olympus Zuko leather pouches, by the way. Just a little old school thing. So this 18-55 is a pretty interesting lens because it is an f2.8 to an f4, pretty fast for a kit lens. It drops off pretty quickly, but very small. It has optical image stabilization. You can set it to auto iris or manual iris if you want, which is on the barrel of the lens. And you can, you know, it's a good little lens. It's not expensive, especially if you buy it with a camera. It does have an issue, which I'm just going to tell you guys to watch last week's episode, where just like the 16-80, as you're zooming through the range, you're seeing essentially exposure changes within that zoom, and then it settles both in terms of exposure and focus, and then you've got an image that is equivalent at a different focal length. The downside to that is that you are kind of forced to use this and this lens, the 18-55 in this lens, as a variable prime, meaning as you are using the lens, you are well, you're changing your focal length, and then you are going to either roll camera, or if you were rolling camera continuously, you're not going to probably use the footage through the zooming portion of your image. Other lenses that I have, I don't shoot with this one very often for video, almost never, which is a 56-1.2. And I don't because it's really, it's what I use for stills. It's really for portraits. But what I do have here, which I think is sort of the go-to right now, is this little 35 millimeter. It's the f2 version. They make a 1.4, which is a little noisier. It's obviously faster by a stop, but this little lens is incredibly compact. It is also weather resistant. So when you couple that or marry that with the X-T3, it's really great for different environments. And what's nice is they have a bunch of lenses that are weather resistant that are small like this. They make a 16 f2.8. They have a 23 f2, almost exactly like this, at the 35, and they have a 50 millimeter. Now I have the 56-1.2 as that sort of focal length. But these are all really small, and I think that for a lot of people, the 23, 35, and 50, which you can get as a set, is really a great way to use this camera. The thing you have to remember, most importantly, is there's no in-body image stabilization on the X-T3, and those lenses are not optically image stabilized. So you're going to have that on a rig, you're going to have to put it on sticks, you're going to have it on a gimbal or something that's going to basically do that. And yes, 56-1.2 hunts a little bit too much for video, but that's not why I bought it. Maybe I'll get the 52 at some point. And again, the 23, 35, and 50 are all f2, so they all match each other. They're all almost exactly the same size. I really love those lenses. I'm thinking about getting the 23. We'll see what happens and how that goes. Now, the other thing that I have, and I'm investing in for all of my lenses that I'm using for video, are variable ND filters, which is not a new subject matter. But what I've been doing lately with this, and maybe I'll do an episode on it, is I've been getting filter stack caps. So these are metal threaded caps that I'm putting on the back of the very ND, and then I'm getting a specific lens cap to sit on the front, and that's how I now travel with my very ND. So I just have to unscrew the back, but it's incredibly well protected, and I can just leave it in the bag with that basically lens cap and that back metal cap there. Okay, the MKs are coming in. So Josephine says, I'd love to get the MKs, however, I don't think the Fuji camera for them do not exist. I own 2 X-T3s and 2 XH1As. So to that, I will say this, Josephine. You can actually put the X-mount MK lenses right onto an X-T3, and they do make it in X-mount. I mean, it is made in E-mount as well. So it's a lens, or they are lenses that you can put on here. You've got the 18-55 and the 50-150. Excellent lenses. T2.9, beautiful image, lightweight. Not as lightweight when you're, pairing it with an X-T3, but still very lightweight. And you absolutely can use those lenses with this camera system. There's also Surei's coming out with a 50 millimeter anamorphic lens for the Fuji cameras, and I'm hoping to get that in sooner rather than later when it's available to do some tests and actually create a video on that. Anamorphic is not part of what I normally do. I'm more of a spherical person. I'm intrigued by it because the cost is low, and I always like to try new things. Yes, Josephine, I do know what you're saying. We don't know if Fuji is going to make a digital cinema camera, something that might be in the same form factor as, let's say, on the small side, an FS5 Mark II, EVO 1, you know, that size, or even somewhere around, you know, an FS7 Mark II, FX9, C300 Mark II, that kind of thing. I'm getting no indication that they're going to do that. I would love it if they did it. I think it would be great. I also own a C200, and yes, Matthew did use MKs on this short film with the X-T3. You know, in the end, it really boils down to who's using the equipment, of course. And when you have somebody who's an amazing cinematographer, there are some big advantages to having certain ingredients inside of a camera system. Higher data rate is a big one, because no matter how big the color space is and you know, how much dynamic range you have, if you're trying to take that and squeeze it into a tiny amount of data that's being recorded, there's not a lot you can do with it. And I always say that the Sony camera is a good example of that. You can shoot HD at 50 megabits per second, which is still pretty low. When you move to UHD 4K, which is 4 times the resolution, the highest you can record currently to the A7 series cameras is 100 megabits per second. Now, math will tell you that if you want the same quality recording that you were getting in full HD, 1920 by 1080 at 50 megabits per second, the minimum data rate that you should be recording in to get that same quality in UHD 4K, 4 times the resolution, is 200 megabits per second. So it doesn't do that. So that lower data rate is such a huge number. And then, of course, there's other things like 8-bit versus 10-bit. There's really only Canon, in my opinion, that has done this magic secret, you know, unicorn sauce on 8-bit recording. I don't know what they're doing, but it's a lot more 10-bit-ish than it is 8-bit-ish when you start to push and pull the image, especially for gradations. But for most of the other cameras, there is a distinct difference between 8 versus 10-bit recording, which is why people go external a lot of the times with cameras that only record internally. So I wish Fuji would give us a cinema body, even if it's just a box like Zcam at the very least, and most likely they will probably make XH2 a bit more like the S1H. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing where Fujifilm is going with their camera systems. I personally think, Jonathan, that right now that I think that they're going to stay in these lanes of Super 35 and medium format. And the medium format one is a really interesting space. Now, of course, you're talking about completely different lenses in that body. Right now, the medium format offerings are amazing in terms of price point and features for what you're getting for still photographers. But the video is not up to par with the X-T3 all around. If they can get those... Oh, why, hello there, Shiznuts. What is going on here? You better be at the camera and flash later on. So if they can get those ingredients into that medium format body, and we start to see more medium format lenses out there on the market, I think that that's a really interesting space for Fuji to be in, because we've kind of got everybody else in the full format, you know, 35 millimeter full frame world. And if they go medium format, that's kind of like IMAX in your pocket. So we know that their glass is good. We know that they can do video now. And if they can start to put some of these other features in there, then I think that we are going to have a space that could largely be Fuji's if they really ramp up on the video side. And larger than large format is becoming a choice for cinematographers. We know that a lot of feature films now are shot at least in part or in, maybe not in whole. Well, there are. I mean, you have Alexa 65, but a lot of films will shoot big parts of their movies either on IMAX or on this medium format, you know, 65, what was it, 65 to 70 millimeter. So it's pretty interesting. Yeah, a video optimized GFX would be killer, absolutely. So I think sensor size is going to stay that way. Yeah. GH5, G9 form factor for Shiznuts is the best. If they could do the JVC thing with micro 4/3 mount and an APS sensor, that would be the best. Fujifilm system isn't for you. Yeah, I mean, I will say this. You know, when it came to video, when I made a transition to larger sensor, I jumped from, so it went from, ownership-wise, it went from DVX100 series to EX1 series. So that was 1/3 inch jump to 1/2 inch. And then we started to use 35mm lens adapters to get a field of view and a depth, a selective focus like we would get out of 35mm essentially. And then the 5D Mark II. And so that's full frame. And of course, we know what that was like with focus issues and shallow depth of field and everything else. So there's a lot more ingredients in what we're getting with the full format, large format, you know, full frame cameras that are coming out right now, Alexi Mini LF, you know, Sony NS, all of these cameras that are these full frame cameras. But that doesn't mean that C500 Mark II, that doesn't mean that that full frame or large format or 35mm is for everybody. And quite honestly, at this moment in time, I am thrilled with Super 35. And there are so many challenges to going large format, not the least of which is focusing. And at the moment, the vast majority of our screens, our monitoring solutions are HD. So we really have to rely upon focus assist features, expanded focus and those things to even make sure, unless we're pushing through HDMI 2.0 to a consumer monitor, that we're tack sharp in terms of focus. Because we get a false perception of if we're in focus or not when you're shooting in 4K and you're monitoring on HD, because it's basically, you're looking at that 4K on an HD monitor, it always looks like it's in focus, and then you bring it into post and you find, oh crap, I'm a little soft. So there's a lot of things going on with that. So I think, you know, Sigma FP is very interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how, you know, their version of RAW and the way they're implementing it, because it's not ProRes RAW, not Blackmagic RAW, how that's going to play out in terms of usability for everybody in the day in, day out type of scenario. But I'm also very excited about that camera, and it's one of the cameras that's the most exciting to me. So we all win. I think that what we have to acknowledge is that when we're not in scenarios where we're doing production, I don't know who this GEM person is, Jonathan, but you know, we'll get that sorted out. I'm just messing with you. When we're in situations where we don't have a big crew and we don't have, you know, the ability to have somebody sitting there assisting with focus, then I think there's a lot of validity in the conversation of a camera system that has good AF. And, you know, you can argue if you're a purist or you're out there just shooting narrative and you've got an AC and you've got somebody pulling focus for you. But in the real world, when we're trying to make pretty pictures and tell stories, sometimes it's just us and us alone. And there's rarely a photographer that you'll meet today, a still photographer, that feels bad or doesn't think that they're professional because they're using autofocus. Because getting the shot, getting the photo, you know, getting the story is paramount. And you have to know how to use your tool, but then as we get these new features, you have to know when to use those features and when not to use them. Face tracking is a version of autofocus, which is reliable some of the time and not reliable other times, and you have to learn your camera system to know when you should be using and when you shouldn't be doing that. So Jonathan, don't worry, Jonathan, I'm just messing with you. I'm either Jim JIM or I'm Jem GEM to most of the world. But, you know, I got a funny name when I was born, and I'm not changing it. So wondering if you've heard of people using Resolve Color Space transform from F-Log to ARRI Log C. And then another CST from Log to Rec 709. I've been having amazing results. I have not, but I'd be interested in finding out more about that. You know, the log functionality of this particular camera system is a little funky when we're talking about the X-T3. Not funky because it doesn't work well, it does. But one of the downsides here is that when you go into the menu and you are activating F-log, which is, you know, more dynamic range, larger color space, it is not giving you an option internally in the camera system to apply a LUT. So you have to rely upon an external monitor in order to apply that. Which is why a lot of people, I think, are probably shooting in camera using different film simulations. You know, my two favorites are Eterna, and I very much like Classic Chrome. That's just a personal preference in terms of how it's handling and dealing with colors and saturation and stuff like that. Jonathan says grading between the two color space transform nodes means you're working in log C. Very interesting. Yeah, cool. I like what I'm reading here, kids. This is good stuff. Where's my chat? Is it showing up properly? I'm going to put up the chat. Hey, Jimmy. Yeah, call me Jimmy with many M's and many Y's. I like it. There you go. That works for me. So where are we? Man, time flies when you're talking about cameras. What's up, Loom? What else we got here? Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, Jonathan, I'd be interested. Send me a little email through the c47.com. I'd like to hear more about that. I'm not a Resolve person generally in terms of workflow, though I am intrigued, but I need to get better at all of this stuff. So, you know. So Shiznuts is asking, why is the monitor showing red pink? And it's something that I was bringing up earlier on in the live stream, which is basically, I found that when you're using, let me just show it to you. Let me get out of here. Under screen setup, I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to do this very quickly. Information contrast adjustment. When I'm using these high contrast, standard, low contrast, when you hit record, especially when you're in low light environments, when that record button's going, you basically are seeing an exposure change. It almost looks like a pulsing. So the screen's getting a little bit brighter, it's getting a little bit darker, and that's what's happening. So if you go into this menu, and I hate that it doesn't always remember what menu you're in, but we won't talk about that, I just did. If you go in here and you set it to dark ambient lighting, then when you're hitting record, I'm not noticing that pulsing, that changing. Now, it's not something that gets recorded to the recorded image, and there's the quick version of what I said. Not a Resolve person. We need to get that resolved. Yeah, funny. Where we go? Yeah. Jonathan, definitely share with us if you can. If you have an article up, or you've shot a video about it, or you just want to put something there, that would be awesome. Good. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this camera. Those are some of the tips. I do have a getting started with video with this camera on the channel, so you can check that out if you're new to the channel. Not getting into every single thing here right now, but basically those are some of the things that I think are important for the system there. What I'd like to do is find out if there's any general production questions that you have. And Zlatko, hello from Oregon. And I'd like to go to Bulgaria at some point and see that place and eat some of that food, because that's one of my favorite things to do when I travel. And there you go. So what do we have for questions? Because I think I'm going to go for about another 5, maybe 10 minutes. And we will basically wrap this thing up. As always, well, with very few exceptions, Wednesday is camera and flask day. So I don't have a drink with me right now because it's very early in the morning, but I will later on, and it will be myself, Caleb Pike from DSLR Video Shooter, and Ben Barden from benbarden.co.uk. We will be talking about Netflix approved cameras, and specifically talking about this S1H and our thoughts on that and how that works. Jamaica, yes, I'm in. So let's see. Oh, wow, there's a lot of geography going on here. I haven't posted anything about this. It's something I recently found out, and Resolve only added. F-Log into its system for that color space transform in the latest release, 16.1. Good to know. But basically, you're doing a transform. So you're basically going from F-Log and then eventually winding up in log C, which is a beautiful thing. It's fun to play with all this stuff. In the real world, for banging out work, you have to decide when it makes sense to do that. Now, what are we talking about here? There was one question. I'm going to get to that monitoring one. Where are we? Laughing, Bulgaria, U.S. Virgin Islands, Yo Man. Okay, we got a whole thing going on here. Okay, good. So here's a question. How do you prefer monitoring exposure with the X-T3 and an external monitor, waveforms, false color, etc.? Definitely waveform monitor. One of my gripes with this camera, which I'm hoping they can resolve at some point because there's no reason why they can't, is something called zebras. And it's not something that I like to use, to be honest with you. But if you turn your zebra settings on, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to set my zebras to under 50%. And lowest setting on this camera is 50. And the reason that would be advantageous to me is because when I bring up a 18% gray card, I will generally, when I'm shooting in log, expose for middle gray at 40 IRE or 40%. And so if I could have zebras show up at 40, then as soon as they show up, as long as that gray card is pointed in the direction I want it to be pointed in for exposure, then I can quickly and easily make sure that that is correct. Then you're going to have to also look at your, if you're using the internal screen, you are going to have to look at the histogram to make sure that you're not clipping your highlights. But preferably, it's going to be a waveform monitor. I have that obviously on the Focus. You have that on, on an Atomos Shinobi. You have that on these new Andy Cine monitors. And you can basically just bring up a waveform monitor and expose that for approximately 40 IRE. Make sure you're not clipping highlights and all of that fun stuff. I can't find anyone using this for F-Log. For me, it's by far the best way to de-log the Fuji image and grade with most flexibility. It doesn't crunch up the image like the Fuji. Interesting. Okay, well, you need to do something. You need to write something, Jonathan, or make a video, right? You make videos, I think. Did you say you made a video earlier? No, Tommy made a video. Well, Jonathan, you make videos, you shoot videos, make a video for us on this. How is the data rate? Oh, that's the question. Data rate's great in the X-T3. It's magical. It's magical. We're on par with the Panasonics of the world. And so you can go in here and your data rate caps out at 400 megabits per second. That's beautiful. 10-bit 420 if you're shooting in HEVC, H.265. There you go. What else we got? Is there a possibility to adjust zebra on the C200 since no false color is available? It's kind of annoying. Yeah, zebras go below 50 on there. I'm not a false color person, but yes, almost 100% sure you can go. Because it has a waveform monitor, I'm generally not bringing up zebras on that camera, but I did do that recently, and you can, as far as I know. There we go. Yes, 400 megabits per second, all intra or long op, depending on what your flavor is and what your experience is working with that footage in post. So you've got to find your combination. Yeah. And there you go. So what else you got there? It's a beautiful thing. And here's your recording speeds here, as you can see. So you can do different stuff. All right. Any questions other than that? What you got? We're wrapping this thing up. How is audio and camera? Zlatko, it's fine. It's comparable to most mirrorless and DSLR cameras, better than older cameras that were sort of first, second gen. I don't like false color. It's just not the way I work. And I have some color issues in terms of differentiating colors. So false color is not great for me. Unbeknownst to most of the world, there's a much larger percentage of men versus women who have some form of color blindness, and I do have some issues differentiating colors, so false color is not great for me. I can use it because on a monitor like the SMALLHD, I can actually choose what colors I want to designate to different ARRI values, so I don't have to go with the defaults that the manufacturer might be putting in there for false color. But it's never been, for me, the tool that I've used to judge exposure, and that's really the main reason. Random thought, interest, do you have a projector? I don't know. I don't know about this projector. Send me a link, but do it on the C47, not in the chat. I'd love to see it. I do have a projector, but it's like a 720p projector. It's one that I use for teaching and has 2 HDMI inputs. It's not something I use for watching content generally. I use it for educational stuff. I have it packed up. Good. Okay, so what else do we have in terms of questions here on the camera system or anything else in general? Because I'm going to start to wrap it up. 9:51 a.m. here, and again, we've got Cameron Flask coming up in about 6 hours from now. Hopefully my transmission gets fixed on my car, and I get my car back today because I'm teaching a workshop in Portland on Friday, and I have to go set up tomorrow. It's a great camera. There's things about it that bug me. I don't like that I can't apply a LUT to the screen internally. That's a problem for me. I don't think that that's ideal. I would like that, but for the price of the camera system and the feature sets that you're getting, especially if you're a person who likes to shoot both stills and video, it's a knockout. I mean, it really is pretty close to what we would say is a home run for a mirrorless camera system. There's clearly room to improve. A lot of that just has to do with giving us little features that we would love to have on a video camera. Panasonic's killing it with the GH series when it comes to assist features, waveform monitors, and all of the other stuff that you get. But I would say that all in all, for your dollars and cents, as long as you don't need to go full frame, and you're not looking for a camera with the absolute best low light capabilities, though it's very admirable, and I'd shoot at 3200 on this camera for sure. I'm very happy with this. I'm very interested to see where they go with this, and again, the medium format side of things with that IMAX in your pocket. I'm sure they will continue down that route, and maybe one day we'll get a digital cinema camera in this form factor. I'm not sure, but I will say I appreciate you all, and I appreciate you all for tuning in, and please subscribe to the channel if you are not a subscriber. The idea here is to just keep creating content. Prediction. Will the XH2 come out with the tilt swivel screen? With a tilt swivel? I sure hope so. That is also a downside to this camera system. I mean, if they had added things like a waveform monitor and a flip out, flip up screen, then you're really talking super killer overall. The tactile usage of this camera is amazing. This on-off switch is a little fiddly. I wish it had a lock that they have a lock here on your shutter and your ISO buttons that you can lock down, which I absolutely love. And why can't you lock that? Why can't you lock exposure compensation? Anything that's going to change my picture or accidentally turn off my camera system is a problem. So there you go. Very angle screen would be great. Zlotko, you're welcome. Have a good day. Come back in 6 hours. We'll be doing more content on the channel. It's been a pleasure. And again, if you have any questions, go to the c47.com/contact. That's where you can share information with me as well, or links to other content. And I'll see you guys next time on another episode of Gearbox. Switching over to the logo as soon as that shows up. then I'm going to end the episode and we should be all good